So let's start. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the session. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Rika Swanzen. She's a project manager for School of Social Sciences at the Institute of Independent Education, MSA, and has been developing and teaching in the field of child and youth care since 2009. Right? And yeah, she's authored 18 peer-reviewed publications since 2007. She's a postgraduate supervisor and external examiner and one of the editors of the Relational Child and Youth Care Practice Journal, so which is a very informative journal for those who haven't been to that site yet. So just quickly, the outcome of a doctoral study was a classification system for describing childhood social functioning problems. And since the study, she has also served as the project manager on national and provincial level research projects. So without further ado, I'd like to hand you over to Dr. Swanzen. The floor is yours, ma'am. And yes, it's all yours. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Harold. So I will definitely just jump into it. So this is the overview that you're going to hear from me today. So firstly, I'm going to remind you of the need for why it's important to have evidence-based assessment very shortly, because you do know that we have limited time in a conference setting and I should never become a lecturer in these settings. Then just touch on the ecological theory based in child and youth care, describing what Ecometrics is, and then also how the current status is around how it's becoming accredited as tools through the council. And then I'm going to demonstrate one such tool. So it's a classification system, which was the outcome of my PhD that was mentioned. So the first part will feel a little bit like theory, so bear with me, and then the rest of the presentation will be a lot of demonstration through pictures. So firstly, what is necessary to understand is that for as long as we will need funding, all of you know that even if you NGO or if you're a government organization, then someone pays for the salaries, there's some fundraising that's involved, and therefore there's some reporting involved as well. And that's probably one of the biggest reasons why like a few decades ago already, there was a question around how do we measure what we do in social services. So luckily, those 2 decades ago already, people have been starting to work on this. But the key thing to remember is that it's not only about the ability to say what you've done, to reflect back to your funder, what it is that you've actually been doing so that you have sustainability in your funding. It's also a big benefit in terms of protecting our clients. If we cannot describe what we do, the practice becomes a risk in itself. So standardized measurement tools provide such a surety because it quantifies and qualifies what we do and also monitors progress. So we can see not only what the problem is, but whether the intervention is successful. So there's all kinds of statistical ways around this, which I won't go into today. But in terms of on the user interface, what we can know is that any such tool, which we call in our field Ecometrics, and I'll explain that in a moment a bit more, but what that, once you have such an accredited tool, that is what you can be sure would have been proven. They had to prove their reliability as a tool to actually measure impact in interventions. So currently we've already had a Ecometrics policy approved in 2011 already with the previous council, and the fourth council in the current council endorsed this as well through the approval of the procedures in 2016. So all the documentation are in place, and what this means in short, so there's a lot of things, there's a lot of documentation around this already in place, but if I can try and capture it in 2 points. Firstly, the main purpose is that it enables scale developers to submit and have the instruments evaluated by an expert panel, and then formally adopted and become part of a repository of instruments with the council. And then, but to do this means that a certain amount of evidence needs to be provided with each submission of such a scale. And 2 key points here, it's a lot of things to prove, but the key point is you have to show that there was some study around your tool that actually showed that it has validity and reliability, and you would usually unpack your scale items, your methodology that's followed on how to develop it, but also how your tool works. And then in addition, the unpacking to the user of how the scoring manual will work or what the procedure around the assessment is. So that's really like it's taking a long, complicated process and trying to put it into a nutshell. So if I can then jump into the ecological framework. The reason why I do this is the measurements that we use, the tools that we use, needs to speak to the sector. So if the sector cannot recognize what is being assessed, then they can reject the tool. It means that it doesn't speak to the sector. So most of you, if you've done any training, if you've not come across this little picture in some or the other form, then you probably need to speak to your lecturer or your facilitator, because most of us know, and you'll see it later on when I brush over the internationally recognized definition of child and youth care, you will see that the scope of practice bases itself on an ecological development framework. So this is the ecological part of it. And I'm definitely not going to try and explain it to you, but the highlight is for the tool that I'm going to demonstrate, and some of the theory I'm going to unpack for you is around the microsystem. So this finds itself here. So the child or the client is in the middle, and that's the microsystem. So in short, why this is relevant is the measurement tool needs to show how the interaction between these systems are measured. So you'll see the demonstration I'm going to use even goes further into the macro system and wider systems, but this is key to know, to identify whether ecometric tool is actually ecometric tool. So this is now the theory part. So what I would like you to encourage you to do is this is the title of an article that was written by Dirksen. If you Google it, you'll actually find a PDF that you can download for free, so it's open source. But I've just highlighted a few things from this reading, because what the author does there is to do a literature review to actually show the influence that the ecological theory has in CYC. So without like getting you stuck in all of the detail around this, the key to it is that from early on, there's been roots. The whole move to ecological was to say you can never understand a client by themselves. Like a child or a family cannot be perceived only by themselves, and they are influenced by their environment. And a lot of these extracts that I've taken from the article shows that. So if I go to this third point, if they talk about the microsystem as a pattern of activities, roles, interpersonal relations experienced by the developing person in a given setting with particular physical and material characteristics. This is now what Bronfenbrenner was the first person to unpack this theory, to develop this actually, in fact, for us. So if you read these words, you will see later, I've highlighted them in red if you're going to see them again in the tool that I'm going to demonstrate. And in blue, I've actually highlighted what other words you would have seen in your child and youth care scope of practice training, which is linked to this. So it talks about the fact that an individual engages in certain roles and interactions with an environment and with others. So the micro space that I've showed you in the previous slide is close, it's the family relationships, it's a school, it's that close environment that they're talking about. So here's the international definition that I said I'll just quickly brush over, but you will recognize this, that we work in this space in terms of normal and special needs of children within the context of a family, the community, and the lifespan. And there you will see that development ecological perspective emphasizes the interaction between persons and the physical and social environments. So this is where, if we say that we're going to measure, use measurement for assessment and intervention purposes, we need to work in this space in terms of a theoretical base for that tool that we want to design or that we want to use. And just some further, most of you will recognize Myers as a recognized scholar in our field, and you will see that he specifically spoke to Bronfenbrenner's work, saying that we've moved away from the one-way interaction and client caring to this reciprocal nature, and he actually links it to the interactional attachment orientation, which comes from Bronfenbrenner's thinking. Yeah, so if we don't have questions yet, then I'll be surprised. So feel free to bring me back to any of these slides. So what is ecometrics then? So from the theory, from the ecological theory, some scholars have actually broken it down to say, what is it that we then need to do in practice? So before they even get to measurement. So they realize that we have two key words. We have a habitat, which means that space that someone inhabits, and a niche, which means whatever space or role that person takes up. So all of those unpacking is for the sake of scale developers that needs to understand where to find a theoretical base from and how to support that they're doing an ecometric tool. So in its simplest form then, ecometrics is the measurement of ecology in social sciences. So why the word ecometrics, why that was most likely decided on was you would probably recognize something similar, which is psychometrics. So when social workers and social scientists started developing tools, they needed to be differentiated from the psychometric tools because, as you probably know, they are highly regulated through the Health Council and through psychology boards, professional boards. So we needed to make sure that the starting point of ecometrics was to say where we differentiate from psychometrics. So in its simplest form, like I said, it means it measures that space where the interaction between the individual and the environment is. Okay, so then why then a classification system? So this is me now switching over to a demonstration of one of such ecometric tools. I actually wanted to highlight something else. No, I'm fine. Sorry about that. I've covered it. So why we would want a classification system? A classification system is an example of a hybrid model. So if you would go back to the ecometrics policy, which I've not covered in detail, but it will talk about different explanations of different types of tools. So it's not just that self-reporting scale. So all of you, the moment we think about measurement scales, we immediately go to that. How do you feel from fully agree to not agree at all, 7 scales? So that's not the only ecometric tools that we're talking about. So there's a variety of them. Some of them qualify the problem and some of them quantify the problem. So the biggest difference is if you only quantify it, it means you unpack it. So it will be an observation guideline. So it's very well researched. It's also a very good tool. It has validity, but it doesn't use numbers. You don't need to statistically work out any numbers around it. If they quantify it, they put numbers to it. So that's the most basic differentiation between it. Something like this classification system is a hybrid model. So it actually speaks to both sides. It qualifies it, it unpacks it through descriptions, and it also gives a number value to it. But the benefit of this specific one that I'm showing to you is that it doesn't really require any calculation, but it does use number values as placeholders that actually minimizes and simplifies the reporting. So that I'll show to you when I get to the pictures. So why it's important to have a classification system is when I did this, the reason why I came across this in terms of interest from my doctorate study, and this is now quite a few years ago, the one thing that I got when I explored certain topics, I kept on coming across this idea like, I can't research this because social work is this and social services is this, as if there was this understanding that we like a charity occupation and we don't really meet the standards of professionalizing. So I became more and more curious about what gives recognition to a profession. And one of the key things that actually stood out is that a profession needs to explain to society what it does. And one example, and this is on a high level, it's not just, saying, well, this is what social workers and child and youth care workers do. It means it's those accepted methods and tools that's being used by the sector to actually explain. People understand what the profession does. And one such example is the DSM system. So most of you will know in psychiatry and psychology, the diagnosis happens according to like axis. There's different axes for different types of problems. And that actually describes to society, although they don't need to understand the DSM system, they know that they go to a psychiatrist or psychologist to get a diagnosis for depression or any type of psychiatric problem. So in a similar vein, already in 1987, way before my doctorate study, people started, a group of social workers started on this already in Santa Barbara in the USA, and they developed what they call the person and environment system. And they did this through many years of research of what do social workers say they actually do, which brought them to systems theory, which brought them back to the ecological model, because that's the mother theory of systems theory. And so this tool was actually designed to be quite generally applicable, which is one good thing about the classification system. But the key thing that they sort of broke the mold with is that because professions like social work and child and youth care work on strength-based principles, we don't diagnose problems. So we cannot just adopt the DSM-4 or the DSM-5 by now for our practice. We cannot assess through that system because it doesn't prescribe, it doesn't speak to what we do. So they then developed something that works on a similar basis, but it's a classification system that only describes problems with the option to identify what the strengths of this particular client. So that like broke the mold in terms of what we were busy with. So the only limitation at that point was that it actually was only for adults. So that's when I then did my doctorate study to design one that's for 0 to 18 years, because we know that most of the social service professions focus on children and we have a large youth population. So it just won't work to just adopt a system like this from another country that's only applicable to 18 years and older. So just some other, so apart from that, it actually increases the professional status of a profession. It's actually quite inclusive because it doesn't matter in what setting you work. If you are busy with the core work of a social worker and a child and youth care worker, you will be working ecologically. And therefore, this system will be able to speak across settings, which makes it more inclusive, which by default will increase multidisciplinary work. And it's also then a standardized method of reporting that can be used to reflect the profession instead of the funder. So why I say this is I finished my studies right in the middle of the 1994 changes in terms of there was major and significant changes to the betterment of our sector. But practice was still like 5 years behind, and policy and legislation was like 5 years ahead. And what I experienced with being a new person, like being trained in the new dispensation, you know, we had the theory to do community work, but coming into practice, there's still individually based work. So being in that space, what really got me, and I didn't realize it would have such a big effect on me, is I saw how officers struggled to change from welfare templates and reporting to social development templates and reporting. And I just asked myself a question after like a few years, does psychology ever need to do this? You know, whenever there's a change in the sector, whether it's a needed change or not, are they actually influenced by the systems that employs them? Or is their professional identity so strong that they just adapt? You know, they go and they say, this is how we're going to meet your need. And that's what bothers me if I look at what NGOs and organizations sees as their reporting structures, because it's often the stats templates of the department or whoever else. And not that I'm saying those are not important because it's for funding, but if they actually understand that we can assess ourselves and we can demonstrate to them what we're actually doing, would that not be the templates that we're using? So that I leave out there, and I really hope it sparks some debate because I still feel very strongly about that. So benefits of specifically this classification system is that it, I've already said it can be implemented across settings, but it was tested among those. So if you find the books that was written on the PI system, you will see that it was tested in different settings. So this is not just a claim that they're making, they actually researched this. And it also cuts across various theoretical orientations. So by this, I mean, everyone's working ecologically and developmentally and systems theory based. But within that, you find that people prefer a certain model, you know, compared to another one. But all of those should find a space in something like this because it's so broadly, you know, it covers the theoretical foundation so broadly. And further studies also was done in different countries. So it also shows that because it was actually tested, the PI itself was tested as part of my master's study in South Africa, and there were other similar studies as well. So it's actually a system that stood the test of, you know, like cultural indigenous testing. Once again, because it's so broadly, so the person using it has the space to implement, you know, to incorporate what is indigenous and what is culturally relevant. I've already spoken about this. So the biggest benefit to this is that it actually avoids labeling, which is the biggest reason why we don't want to use diagnosis. And it also considers many systems. You'll see when I show you some of the pictures, and what the core between that is the interaction between it. Does the environment actually provide the needs of the individual, and can the individual, do they have the capacity to access those resources? And I've mentioned this already, and then by default, if we use it as a reporting structure, it will make for a better reporting in my mind. And then the accurate referrals, you'll see that if everyone uses a system like this, because that's the point of a classification system, it should be broadly adopted to work at its optimal capacity. You would be able to just send a code over to someone, and they'll be able to unpack on the other side without a lot of forms, without a lot of reports. They'll be able to know what's going on, and that I'll show you when we get to the end. Okay, so if you're still with me, if I'm not hearing Harold saying something, I'm assuming you're still with me. So this is just a bit of the background that I've covered a little bit. There is an article that I've also referenced at the end in 2011 that actually speaks to the 2 studies that was actually done on the child pie. So just to unpack it a little bit, if we talk about person and environment practice, there's 3 key things. It's improving a client's sense of mastery in dealing with stressful life situations, meeting environmental challenges, and making full use of the environment resources. So that's the part where they're in a certain role, and the roles are going to become a bit more practical to you now if I show you some of the pictures. Then achieving, but specifically, it's not just the role, it's the ability to actually access resources that they need. Achieving this end through active assessment, engagement, and intervention in the environment, and then linking individual concerns in ways that promote social empowerment through collective action. So what the original pie did is it said that it created uniform statements of the social roles, the environmental, mental, physical health problems, and client strengths. So the environmental it's just one word there, but in the system itself, it's like, it's like 6 different parts that actually gets evaluated. So they unpack environmental as well, but it gives space to actually also bring in a diagnosis from a psychiatrist or from a doctor. So it's just a place, because we don't involve ourselves in those, it's a place where it's just recognized in the whole assessment process. And then, as I mentioned, the coping ability and strengths. So then when we had to do this for children now, we had to create the same names and the same unpacking. So developmental niche was a big part that we could actually, from a lot of literature, pull together. And it actually refers to not only that setting, but you will see the culturally regulated customs for childcare, socialization and behavior management, and the psychology of caretakers, including beliefs and values about the nature of development. So all of these things had to be unpacked in terms of the theoretical contact that eventually became the definitions and the statements. That when I showed you the definition of pie, it's those, what are these statements that we are using? So in effect, it means that the whole design leads to a manual that a user has that says, this is the description of this role, and that description comes from literature and research and testing. So it's a very safe definition to use to know that you are actually looking at the role functioning in that particular area. And you should recognize these from child and youth care theory as well. So this is as simple as we can put it, because development theory by itself is, we spend at our institution, we spend a whole semester on development for child and youth care workers. So this is a very simplified form, but just to break it down, to make sure we cover everything, we have domains in the middle. So when we talk about the developmental theory that's built into the system, we look at the domains and the stages. So often people only look at one of the two. So you need to have that interaction between the two to understand, because physical development is totally different at the same stage than social development. Different milestones, different needs. So that's another thing. Milestones was like part of the theory that went into the foundation of the tool. So that is just to show what was actually used. Now, this is another example of how concepts from theory was used. So in the end, from literature, we had to make sure that it is fully exhaustive, the list. So we had to identify the role. So they are in the outside, and you can now see this is an old diagram. It happened like quite a few years ago. It's not as fancy as these days software would allow you to, but these were all the roles. So at the end, what might not look so clear there is it's juvenile on the one, and then there's caregiver on the other side. So the caregiver we included as a child role to cover the child-headed household. So the child's supposed to be a child in terms of the developmental stages, but they are actually the role that the problem might be in is the caregiver role. So there you can see we had to differentiate. We didn't, at that point when we talked about biological children and adopted children, there was a lot of pushback in the literature to say that this separates, you know, people shouldn't refer to children like this because then it's like they're not the real children. So we opted for, you know, different names, but the definition, the description under that would indicate that it's linked by some law, or biological would be the natural, or by some or the other, the surrogate child has a different meaning. So here you can see different, there's the social interaction skills we were getting from literature to say these are the key ones that we're looking at if we talk about socialization of children. Because one thing that this focus more on is social functioning, because social functioning lends itself better to understanding the interaction between a role and an environment. And then we had to look at barriers to social interaction and developmental task involved. So this is not going to make you fully understand what's behind it, but just to show the extent of what the development had to cover to get to the tool in the end. And then the child pie has its own definition to just say that it provides role descriptions for different areas of social interaction with consideration of the intricacies of problems in these roles and the influence child maltreatment, with an indication of the duration of the problem and the coping strengths the child may possess. So this is the first picture now. See, I promise you at the end there will be pictures. So this is factor one, is the social functioning. So all of that detail that lies behind it, in the end, gets captured on one form like this. So it's one page form. All your indexes are on the same form. So what this means, the role is here on the side. You tick which role is relevant. There could be more than one, because you'll see that at the end, you do get to use this priority code. I hope you see my little mouse that I'm moving around. So there's a priority code that actually, based on the coping strengths and the duration of the problem, you will indicate if it's a primary, secondary, or relevant problem. And these are also defined in a manual. So you will know that primary is key, like it needs immediate intervention. It's the first problem to focus on. But then you can assess other problems, but they might not be primary at this point, because you may likely only be able to work on one problem at a time. So when you identify which role the problem is in, the social interaction problem is in, it immediately gives you a code. So this is just for you to remember. You can see there's no calculation involved. You have a space holder. So if I would say caregiver role, I would have 14 will be the start of that. That will mean caregiver. Then the problem type you get here from the bottom. So you can now see it's either a mouse. So all of this came from those theories that I've tried to show to you. So from those key aspects had to be identified. And the most important ones from literature and the testing of the tool were these ones. So each one of them has their own description in the manual. So for you to fully understand what it means. Some of those you can immediately identify. So like oppositional defiance, we already know these are behavior issues. Milestone delay is a developmental issue, but then we have other issues as well. So loss was included to cover something like there isn't a problem with the child's ability, but the child is probably grieving. So just to have that wide coverage of possible problems. Then we, with input and with a lot of studying around this, the abuse type, this is not on the adult one. So this was included for the child by only to indicate the abuse type. So there's either no maltreatment, then it's fine. But the reason why we need that is we know that any person working with children needs to report abuse. So you might be assessing and working on an issue. Not only will any form of abuse affect what you're doing, but it also would flag and need to report. So each one of these, I'll show you later on. It's like you're not going to be able to read it, but I'll just show you how extensively, in short, so that it's usable by the user, but also how extensive or how complete they try to make the, and they, I mean me, and everyone that participated in the study, So it's not they, it's we. So just to see that how they actually try to really be very sharp with those definitions, like it must immediately speak to the issue that we are addressing. So the duration of the problem also has its own mission. So some of it, like if you indicate less than 2 weeks, it might indicate an acute thing. Like if it's more than 5 years, it could indicate a chronic problem, but it could also indicate that there's some coping ability. So this is what the definition unpacks for you to consider. So the moment you indicated the strengths, and I'll also show you an example of the coping strengths definitions, but if you now consider these things together, that would lead you to decide what priority this problem has. So this is what I meant, that you'll probably not be able to read it, but there is the unpacking of the definitions. So it's even intimidation by peers. So we kept it broad, but it includes bullying, but also gossip, name calling. So if you just quickly try to look at those names, you will see. So the point of it was that you know that anything under that definition will be indicated by that. So it doesn't mean if a child is not physically or sexually abused that there isn't a level of this challenge to their functioning that shouldn't be indicated. And this is what the coping index would look like. So outstanding would be that. So if you would say they get a 1 year and it's like the duration of the problem has been more than 5 years, then probably you'll be supportive in your intervention. It won't be acute. So that's just one example. This is one. I think I have more examples for you, but I won't discuss all of them in detail. But you can't just say environment and then just, broadly say, oh yes, no, there's no support or there's some support. So anyone that knows, we have like a semester that we let the students focus on community profiling and building support networks, because one of the key community interventions is actually to use what's already there. But if no one has a tool to assess that with, then it becomes difficult as well. So a profile is usually a very broad thing and used for different reasons, but a tool like this makes it closer to home. It brings it closer to what we want to know about social service delivery. So if you just have a look at a few of those, this is the economic or the food systems, the economic basic needs one. There you'll see lack of regular food supply. So you will see it doesn't need to be a total lack of food supply, just a lack of regular food supply. So there was, for each word in the system was very deliberately chosen with its definition. An absence of a shelter. So now you can indicate anything that is economic or basic needs driven. Then you will see that it has a 5-1 would indicate we are sitting with the 5th one that's being in the roles. We went from 1 to 4. So now we had number 5. So 5 would immediately identify the economic basic needs, and 1 would identify food or nutrition, where 2 would be linked to shelter, 3 would be linked to employment. I think you get the gist. And then obviously the 01 would be the subcategory. A problem type, it works on the same basis as the role one, but these are different. You will see now we don't focus on an interaction problem, although it's linked to interaction. We now focus on a type of discrimination. So if we now say that there's a lack of regular food supply, but there's actually a type of discrimination involved, then you would include this, like non-citizenship. So there is food in a community, but because they're not a citizen, they're not accessing the food. Then in the same way, you have the severity and the coping strengths and the duration and the severity index. Okay, so this is just to show you the other systems. So you have the same for educational, for judicial and legal systems, for health services and mental health services, and then they also included voluntary association systems and affectional support systems. So this was necessary to make sure that all of the influences from the environment was covered, and they all work on the same basis. So just to give you a bit of an idea of the definitions, like they will define the environmental systems that we've just covered based on the function that they're supposed to have when we talk about the interaction between the person and the environment. Then so for each category, there was category definitions for each and everything, which is something you won't see because that does require training. The big benefit of this is that it needs training to fully understand and some practice to use it, but after that it doesn't cost. You know, it's not something that needs some of the other, you know, like for scales, you often need to buy the scales. You know, you need to buy a quantity of scales to use, and it's the same with psychometrics as well. So this doesn't work on that basis. It's a classification tool that once you understand it, and because you have to use it correctly, otherwise you decrease the validity and the reliability of the scale. So that's one of the things. But each one of them, if you probably already, validity means that when you look at it, you can actually see that it does this, describe what it's supposed to describe. So it assesses what it is intended to assess. And then the studies that was done on it was inter-rater reliability, meaning that if the same person is using the tool on the same case study, they should get to very similar outcomes. So that was already done, and most of that I've explained to you. And this is just the duration index that I've also explained. Okay. I'll just leave. This is just the unpacking as well, that everything has a definition. So here's the end that I said I'll show you at the end. So this is like the capture sheet or the scoring sheet. So everything, you will now see that it even helps you. Your placeholder is there. So for the social role, your code would have been sitting there. The type would be there, the duration there, the coping there, and then the, so I've covered all of them. Then you basically just transfer them over here. The little block is for the developmental aspect. So it's linked to the stage, where you will say that it's number 1, 2, 3, or like A, B, C, or D, depending on what stage it is. And this circle is for the priority symbol. So is it priority, or is it secondary, or a relevant problem? And you do the same for the environment. So this is what I mean, that you can have more than one, because it could be that this is it's just a relevant problem, but my primary problem is up here. So it literally means that this can be a stats sheet. If everyone understands the coding, then this, including with, because now you'll do one, this is factor 2. So you might not have a problem in each, but there's space for 4, and it can probably be more as well. But it means that if I send this code to someone at the end, that's at the bottom, and they're using the same classification system as me without needing to do any calculations, they actually will know what it is, what the problem is. They can unpack it on their side without me sending any confidential information across. But the code will obviously be confidential. And this is also what I mean, that if this can become linked to the stats that you have to deliver, then you're not only doing comprehensive assessment and explaining to clients what it is that they do, what it is that you do, then it also has that benefit. You don't have to double up. And the big important thing about this as well is that you won't be doing it correctly if you try to do this by yourself. This was not created as a scale that is completed, or a checklist that's completed by the practitioner. It is designed, you won't be able to complete this if you don't engage the client. So it means the participation of the client is guaranteed. Okay, so for future development, I've left you an email there at the bottom if you are curious to find out more, if I've hopefully stirred some interest and some excitement about this. But where we are still is that it definitely can do with some more, expanding on some development. One thing that I felt the coping index can get more from, it's something that I've started on by myself, but I've not done a full formal study yet. But there's a lot of resilience theory over the past 10 years that's actually been quantified and qualified in such a nice manner that you can actually include it in something like the coping index explanations, just to make those more meaningful, because now it means that that index would also reflect a certain type of resilience. And then also temperament, when you go through, temperament's often seen as what psychologists do, but for me it is, most of us know that children do not, there's no one size fits all. So a way to actually incorporate a type of a temperament acknowledgement as well into a tool like this. And then some dream would be, now that all the procedures are settled, and once we have our expert panels in place, then to submit the tool for accreditation through council. And that would be it for me. This is just some of the theories, some of the sources that I've used that I wanted to highlight. Okay, so that's from me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Swanzen. There is one comment and then one question. There is also a DSD assessment tool for children in alternative care, a requirement in the Children's Act. Would be interesting to see how these different tools would be aligned to use to complement one another. So there was that. And then the question was then, social development has developed a risk assessment framework for children in vulnerable condition. How different is this from what you have developed here? Perhaps if you want to just answer that question very briefly.
Yeah. So I would actually really love both of those that left a comment and a question to please email me, because I definitely want to continue the conversation, because this is the wonderful thing about Ecometrics. Not only this tool, I used one of them as an example, the one that I could speak to, but the whole area of Ecometrics needs attention. You know, we need to bring the tools to council so that more practitioners know that they dare to use. And to go through the accreditation process means that it gives that assurance back to the practitioner. So those tools, however they fit in here, you know, that's one part. They are most likely valid tools on their own, which means they need to go through that process and be made available to the sector for use. And that also raises the question that if a funding body gives something, it could be a wonderful tool, but what did it go through the check box or the checklist exercise of the sector? And the answer might be yes, but that's the function of the council. So we definitely need to use this process, because the purpose of my presentation was twofold: to highlight that this is happening at the council and we need to really strengthen this process as a sector, and then also to have a demonstration on a tool. You know, so that was not the main event, was not just this tool. So to answer how it relates to this, most likely this, in a simple form, this can be seen as an umbrella. So when you have, if I compare it against to psychometrics and the DSM systems, because we know that it's been around longer and it's been acknowledged longer, the DSM system provides that overall understanding of where the problem types lie. But within psychometrics, there's a tool for depression and there's a tool for anxiety. So the one does not negate the other one. You know, they don't cancel each other. So they have different purposes. A classification system has a very particular purpose that links back to the status of the profession. So if you call yourself a profession, you need certain things in place. And people can go look at the literature. They say one of the criteria to be acknowledged as a profession is that you have a system that describes what it is that you do. So it has that as a main function, and it will never really, if you want to zoom in, if you're not sure, I mean, we don't work with depression, but just for an example, if you're not sure if the child has a depression, but there's an overall social functioning problem identified, you will carry on with your intervention and assessment underneath that. This tool is too big to do every week. So if you want to do monitoring on a more regular basis, you'll probably complement this with a scale. So if I know that, because I'm trying to think, I don't know if people know about the Hudson scales, but that's the closest we have to psychometric scales. And there are scales there that measures the person and environment fit, but it's a 25 question scale. So someone can use that on a regular basis and actually get something like, you know, a single subject design, which is a statistical way of actually proving that because of your intervention, this problem is improved. That you can only do with a scale, but a scale cannot describe to the extent that a classification system does. And I think that's probably the best comparison to do between the two, without seeing what it is that they're referring to.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Swanzen. There aren't any other comments or questions. And so thank you very much for your time. I think what we're getting out of this is that I think you're looking at more holistically at the person that you're wanting to do the assessment with, if I'm understanding that correctly.
Yes.
And yes, just to also say, yeah, we love Bronfenbrenner. He's back in our books and we're teaching about Bronfenbrenner and the ecological systems approach. So, and I think it's used in the ECBND programs, even with the ECBND Esikoleni program. So we as child and youth care workers, we're quite familiar with Mr. Bronfenbrenner and what the system is all about. But I think just to say to you, thank you very much for your presentation. And I think if there are any other questions, people can just make contact with you through your email that is on the screen. I think get in touch with you with that. But thank you so much for your presentation and enjoy the rest of the conference. Hope you'll stay around.
Pleasure. Same to you. Thanks.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.